What happened in the last 72 hours represents the most sophisticated, coordinated military operation in the history of modern Middle Eastern warfare, and every Western defense analyst who dismissed this possibility is now scrambling to explain how they got it so catastrophically wrong. The unthinkable scenario that military planners spent decades trying to prevent has just materialized with precision that suggests years of preparation, and the implications are so far-reaching that every assumption about regional power dynamics must now be reconsidered. Hezbollah has launched a coordinated offensive from Lebanon. The Houthis have simultaneously escalated operations from Yemen. Israel now faces what defense strategists have long called the nightmare scenario, a genuine three-front war against adversaries who have been preparing for this exact moment for 25 years. And here is what makes this development truly historic. The United States, despite spending $800 billion annually on defense, despite maintaining carrier strike groups in the region, despite decades of intelligence preparation, finds itself unable to meaningfully alter the strategic equation. Let me be absolutely clear about what we are witnessing. This is not random escalation. This is not opportunistic adventurism. This is the execution of a strategic plan that has been developed, refined, and rehearsed over decades, and it is unfolding with the kind of coordination that reveals something profound about the nature of resistance networks in the modern era. Three critical questions will drive everything that follows. How did these actors achieve this level of coordination without triggering Western interdiction? What does this multi-front scenario mean for Israeli defensive capabilities that were designed to handle regional threats sequentially rather than simultaneously? And most importantly, why is American military power, despite its overwhelming material superiority, structurally incapable of preventing what is about to unfold? There are no comfortable answers tonight, but the truth, however inconvenient for established narratives, is the only thing worth examining. By the end of this analysis, you will understand why this moment represents a fundamental shift in regional power dynamics that has been building for a generation, and why the strategic assumptions that guided American and Israeli policy for the last 3 decades have just been proven catastrophically inadequate. Thus, the technical reality of multi-front coordination. Here is what you need to understand about the operational complexity of what just occurred. Hezbollah and the Houthis launched coordinated operations across 2,000 kilometers of distance without centralized command infrastructure that Western intelligence could detect or disrupt. Let that reality sink in for a moment. Two separate organizations operating in different countries under different immediate tactical constraints managed to synchronize major military operations with timing precision that suggests either sophisticated communications networks that evaded detection or, more likely, pre-planned triggers that required no real-time coordination at all. The technical specifications of what these forces deployed reveal capabilities that Western analysts have consistently underestimated. Hezbollah launched an estimated 300 rockets in the opening salvo, targeting Israeli military installations across the northern border with accuracy that demonstrates significant advancement beyond the Katyusha systems of previous conflicts. Intelligence assessments that reached Western capitals indicate these systems include precision-guided munitions with circular error probable measurements under 50 meters, meaning they can reliably hit specific buildings rather than simply saturating general areas. From Yemen, the Houthis demonstrated capabilities that fundamentally challenge American naval supremacy in critical waterways. They launched cruise missiles and drones targeting shipping through the Bab al-Mandab Strait while simultaneously engaging assets in the Red Sea with anti-ship ballistic missiles traveling at speeds exceeding Mach 5. These are not improvised weapons. These are sophisticated systems that require advanced guidance, propulsion technology, and most critically, intelligence networks capable of providing targeting data in real time. The cost asymmetry here is staggering and represents the foundation of why this strategy is so effective. Each Hezbollah rocket costs approximately $15,000 to $30,000 to produce. Each Houthi drone costs between $20,000 and $70,000. The Israeli Iron Dome interceptor that defeats these weapons costs between $50,000 and $100,000 per missile. The American Standard Missile-2 defending ships cost $1.4 million. The SM-6 costs $4.3 million. For every dollar spent on offense, defenders must spend between $50 and $200 on defense. This is not sustainable mathematics. Let me give you the numbers that defense planners are looking at right now and finding no comfortable answer. If Hezbollah launches 5,000 rockets over a sustained campaign at an average cost of $20,000 per rocket, that represents $100 million in offensive investment. To intercept even 60% of those rockets requires 6,000 interceptors at an average cost of $75,000 each, totaling $450 million. The defender spends 4.5 times more than the attacker while still allowing 40% of attacks through. This is the strategic mathematics of asymmetric warfare, and it favors the offense in ways that make Western defense architectures fundamentally vulnerable. The coordination mechanism itself reveals sophisticated strategic thinking. These organizations did not need to communicate directly to achieve synchronization. They needed only to watch for specific triggers that both organizations understood would signal the moment for coordinated action. The trigger appears to have been Israeli operations that crossed specific thresholds, creating automatic escalation responses that were pre-planned years in advance. This approach is brilliant because it requires no communications that can be intercepted, no centralized command that can be decapitated, no coordination meetings that can be disrupted. What Western intelligence agencies are now discovering is that they built their entire surveillance architecture around detecting coordination, and these resistance networks simply designed around that limitation by creating pre-programmed responses that activate automatically when conditions are met. It is the military equivalent of distributed computing, where individual nodes execute local decisions based on shared protocols without requiring central coordination. There's are American impotence and structural constraints. Now, we need to examine the question that American defense planners are asking behind closed doors and finding no adequate answer. Why can't the United States simply use its overwhelming military superiority to shut down this multi-front offensive? The answer reveals fundamental constraints that challenge every assumption about American power projection in the modern era. The first constraint is geographic. Hezbollah operates from southern Lebanon, embedded within civilian population centers across complex urban terrain. The Houthis operate from Yemen, controlling territory the size of France across mountainous regions that have defeated every foreign intervention in recorded history. Israel faces threats from Gaza in the south. These are not adversaries that can be engaged from standoff distance with precision strikes. These are distributed networks that have spent 25 years preparing defensive positions specifically designed to survive American and Israeli air campaigns. American military power is optimized for conventional force-on-force warfare against nation-state adversaries with identifiable military infrastructure. Aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, cruise missiles, these are tools designed to destroy tanks, airfields, command bunkers, and naval vessels. They are far less effective against networks of fighters moving through urban terrain with rocket launchers that can be set up and fired within minutes. The United States military is discovering what it learned in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Overwhelming firepower cannot defeat determined resistance that controls local terrain and possesses popular support. The second constraint is economic, and it represents a crisis that defense planners have warned about for years, but political leaders have refused to address. The American interceptor missile inventory is finite and cannot be replenished at the rate these weapons are being expended. Iron Dome batteries across Israel are firing interceptors at a rate that will deplete available stocks within weeks if the current tempo continues. American ships in the Red Sea are expending standard missiles against Houthi drones and cruise missiles at an unsustainable rate. Here are the production numbers that explain why this is catastrophic. The United States produces approximately 500 standard missiles per year across all variants. Israel produces approximately 2,000 Iron Dome interceptors per year with American financial support. In a sustained multi-front conflict where thousands of incoming projectiles must be engaged monthly, these production rates are inadequate by an order of magnitude. And here is the part that should terrify Western defense planners. These weapons cannot be produced faster because the supply chains for critical components, including rocket motors, guidance systems, and specialized electronics, have lead times measured in years, not months. The United States is discovering that it optimized its defense industrial base for peacetime efficiency rather than wartime production surge capacity. American defense contractors maximize profit by maintaining lean supply chains and just-in-time manufacturing. This is excellent for quarterly earnings reports, but catastrophic when sudden demand requires doubling or tripling production. The Soviet Union and China maintained defense industries designed for surge production during conflict. America does not. The third constraint is financial, and it connects directly to the broader vulnerabilities of the American economic model. Every interceptor missile fired, every carrier strike group deployed, every expeditionary force maintained costs money that America no longer has. The United States national debt exceeds $34 trillion. Annual deficit spending exceeds $2 trillion. Interest payments on that debt now consume more than defense spending. The economic model that financed American military supremacy for 70 years is collapsing, and adversaries understand this vulnerability better than American political leaders appear to. Let me give you a scenario that explains why this matters. If this multi-front conflict extends beyond 3 months, the cost of maintaining defensive operations, replacing expended munitions, and deploying additional forces to the region will exceed $100 billion. If it extends 6 months, costs will exceed $200 billion. This is money that America does not have and cannot print without triggering inflation that would devastate the domestic economy. Adversaries are forcing America into a war of attrition that America cannot afford to fight, and they know it. As for your historical patterns and the hubris of empires, what we are witnessing follows patterns that repeat throughout history with such consistency that only willful ignorance can explain why Western strategists failed to recognize it coming. Every empire that achieved dominant military power eventually faces adversaries who refuse conventional battle and instead wage asymmetric campaigns that exploit the structural vulnerabilities inherent in maintaining far-flung commitments. The pattern is so consistent it might as well be a law of history, yet every empire believes it will be the exception. Rome faced this exact dynamic in its eastern provinces, the Parthian Empire controlling the territory that roughly corresponds to modern Iran and Iraq, refused to fight Roman legions in open battle where Roman discipline and equipment provided decisive advantage. Instead, Parthian forces waged mobile warfare, ambushing Roman supply lines, launching hit-and-run raids, and forcing Rome to deploy massive garrison forces across hostile terrain. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC saw Rome lose 7 legions, approximately 40,000 soldiers, because Roman generals assumed military superiority guaranteed victory. Rome fought Parthia for 3 centuries and never conquered it, exhausting resources that would have been better spent defending frontiers elsewhere. The Mongols conquered the largest empire in human history, defeating every army they faced through superior mobility, coordination, and ruthlessness. Yet, when the Mongols reached the Middle East and attempted to consolidate control over Persia and the Levant, they discovered that holding territory is fundamentally different from conquering it. The Mamluks of Egypt defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, and Mongol power in the region began its collapse. Within 2 generations, the Mongol Empire fragmented into competing khanates that fought each other as often as they fought external enemies. Britain, at the height of its imperial power, controlled a quarter of the Earth's land surface and ruled over 400 million people. The British Navy was supreme on every ocean. British industry produced more manufactured goods than any other nation. Yet Britain could not hold Afghanistan, could not suppress resistance in Ireland, could not prevent independence movements from dismantling the empire piece by piece. The costs of maintaining global dominance exceeded the economic returns, and resistance movements understood that they did not need to defeat Britain in decisive battle. They merely needed to make occupation unsustainable. The Soviet Union, possessing thousands of nuclear weapons, millions of soldiers, and total control over Eastern Europe, invaded Afghanistan in 1979, expecting rapid victory. Soviet military doctrine, developed through decades of experience and proven effective in conventional warfare, proved useless against guerrilla fighters who controlled local terrain and received external support. The Soviets withdrew in defeat after 10 years, having suffered 15,000 dead and contributing directly to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse. The United States, after achieving total conventional military victory over Iraq in 21 days in 2003, spent the next 18 years unable to establish stable governance, losing 4,000 American soldiers and spending $2 trillion before withdrawing in effective defeat. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, overthrew the Taliban in weeks, then spent 20 years unable to prevent Taliban resurgence, ultimately withdrawing as the Taliban reconquered the country in a matter of days. Here is the pattern: empires possess overwhelming conventional military superiority that proves useless against adversaries who refuse conventional battle. Occupying hostile territory requires vastly more resources than conquering it. Local resistance that controls terrain and possesses popular support cannot be defeated through firepower alone. Extended deployments exhaust imperial resources, while resistance movements grow stronger through external support and population backing. Eventually, the imperial power withdraws, having spent blood and treasure achieving nothing permanent. Israel and the United States are now facing adversaries who have studied this historical pattern and designed their entire strategy around exploiting it. Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis will not fight conventional battles where Israeli and American firepower provides decisive advantage. They will wage attritional campaigns from defensive positions in urban and mountainous terrain, where every advance costs the attacker exponentially more than it costs the defender. They will force Israel and America to maintain expensive defensive deployments indefinitely while conducting offensive operations that expend finite resources at unsustainable rates. The historical lesson is unambiguous: this approach works. Empires do not lose because they are militarily defeated in decisive battle. They lose because maintaining dominance becomes economically and politically unsustainable. The United States is learning what Rome, Britain, and the Soviet Union learned. Military supremacy does not guarantee strategic success when facing adversaries who understand how to exploit the structural vulnerabilities of imperial overreach. Istakir, scenario development and strategic predictions. Let me outline 3 scenarios with probability assessments based on structural analysis rather than wishful thinking. Understanding which scenario unfolds will determine everything about regional dynamics for the next generation. Scenario 1: limited escalation and negotiated settlement. Probability 15%. In this scenario, Israel responds to the multi-front offensive with measured strikes against Hezbollah and continues operations against Hamas while accepting Houthi disruption of shipping as manageable cost. The United States pressures Israel to accept diplomatic resolution that freezes conflicts without achieving decisive outcomes. This scenario requires several conditions that current indicators suggest are unlikely. It requires Israeli political leadership to accept outcomes that appear as defeats to domestic constituencies. It requires resistance organizations to accept terms that preserve Israeli security without achieving their own objectives. Most critically, it requires the United States to possess diplomatic credibility with all parties that current positioning has largely destroyed. The probability is low because the political dynamics within Israel make acceptance of negotiated settlement nearly impossible. The current Israeli government has staked its legitimacy on achieving decisive military victory. Accepting anything less means political collapse. Furthermore, resistance organizations have learned from decades of experience that accepting negotiated settlements allows Israel to rebuild capabilities before launching future operations. They have strong incentive to press advantages while they hold them rather than accept pauses that favor Israel strategically. Scenario 2, sustained multi-front attrition. Probability 60%. This represents the most likely outcome based on current capabilities and incentives. Israel maintains defensive operations across three fronts while conducting limited offensive strikes that fail to achieve decisive outcomes. The conflict extends across months, steadily depleting Israeli and American interceptor stocks, straining regional logistics, and imposing economic costs that exceed $100 billion within the first year. Casualties mount but remain below levels that trigger major American ground intervention. Shipping through the Red Sea faces persistent disruption, driving insurance costs to prohibitive levels and forcing rerouting that adds significant cost to global trade. This scenario is most probable because it aligns with resistance strategy objectives while remaining below thresholds that would trigger full American conventional response. Resistance organizations do not need to achieve decisive military victory. They need only to impose unsustainable costs over extended duration. Every month this conflict continues, Israel's economic position weakens, population morale declines, and international support erodes. Meanwhile, resistance organizations maintain recruitment, receive continued external support, and demonstrate that they can survive Israeli military pressure indefinitely. The economic implications of this scenario are severe. Oil prices likely rise above $120 per barrel as markets price in risk of broader regional disruption. Shipping costs through alternative routes add inflationary pressure to global economy already facing structural challenges. American defense industrial base struggles to replenish expended munitions, revealing supply chain vulnerabilities that adversaries will exploit in future conflicts. Within 18 months, political pressure within Israel for diplomatic resolution intensifies as population recognizes that current approach is economically and militarily unsustainable. Scenario 3, major regional escalation. Probability 25%. This scenario involves direct American military intervention against Iran, Hezbollah, or Yemen that triggers escalatory responses, including potential Strait of Hormuz disruption, attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure, or Iraqi resistance engaging American forces. This represents the catastrophic outcome that resistance strategy is designed to bait Israel and America into pursuing. If America launches major strikes against Iran or commits ground forces to Lebanon, the calculus completely changes. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz through which 20% of global oil supply transits. Closing that strait, which Iran can accomplish with mines, missiles, and small boat swarms, would drive oil prices above $200 per barrel within days. The global economic disruption would be immediate and catastrophic. Semiconductor manufacturing, which depends on stable energy costs, would face supply chain collapse. Food production costs, heavily dependent on petroleum-based fertilizers and transportation, would spike, creating potential famine conditions in vulnerable regions. Iranian defensive capabilities are far more sophisticated than American public discourse acknowledges. Iran has studied American military operations for 40 years and built layered defenses specifically designed to survive initial strikes and impose maximum costs on attackers. Underground facilities, mobile launchers, distributed command systems, and asymmetric response capabilities mean that American strikes cannot achieve the kind of decisive outcomes that make escalation worthwhile. Meanwhile, every American escalation provides Iran with justification for responses that America would prefer to avoid. The probability of this scenario, while lower than sustained attrition, remains unacceptably high because it depends on decisions made under pressure by political leaders with imperfect information and domestic constituencies demanding action. Israeli leadership may conclude that escalation represents the only path to avoiding slow defeat. American leadership may believe that demonstrating resolve requires military response. These decisions, made in crisis conditions with incomplete intelligence, could trigger cascades that no party actually desires, but that become unstoppable once initiated. Duxie shares the uncomfortable truth about American decline. Here is what needs to be said clearly and without diplomatic euphemism. The United States is discovering that military supremacy built for 20th century conventional warfare does not translate into 21st century power when facing adversaries who refuse to fight the kind of war America is designed to win. The aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, and precision munitions that cost trillions to develop are being challenged by adversaries spending millions on drones and rockets that exploit fundamental vulnerabilities in American defense architecture. This is not prophecy. This is structural analysis based on mathematical realities that defense planners understand but political leaders refuse to acknowledge publicly. The cost exchange ratios favor offense over defense by margins that make defensive approaches economically unsustainable. The geographic constraints of fighting asymmetric opponents embedded in hostile terrain create tactical environments where American technological advantages provide marginal benefit. The economic fragility of American fiscal position makes extended conflicts prohibitively expensive regardless of military outcomes. What we are witnessing is the beginning of a historical transition that will be studied for generations. The unipolar moment when American power appeared unchallengeable is ending, not through dramatic defeat in decisive battle, but through the steady accumulation of costs that exceed sustainable limits. Empires end this way throughout history. They become overextended, maintaining commitments that exceed resources, facing adversaries who understand how to exploit structural vulnerabilities until eventually the gap between commitments and capabilities becomes undeniable and retrenchment becomes inevitable. The tragedy is that this transition was predictable and indeed was predicted by analysts who understood historical patterns. The strategic error was believing that American technological and economic superiority was permanent rather than temporary, that adversaries would remain passive rather than developing asymmetric responses, that military supremacy could be maintained without corresponding economic foundation, that regional populations would accept American hegemony indefinitely rather than supporting resistance movements that promised independence. Now, let me be absolutely clear about uncertainty and intellectual humility. I might be wrong about specific predictions. Scenario probabilities could shift dramatically based on decisions not yet made or developments not yet visible. The framework of structural analysis provides insight into likely trajectories but cannot predict contingent choices or random events. If these predictions prove incorrect, we will examine why and what that reveals about the limitations of this analytical approach.